So the title is actually Offline and Instant Websites, collectively known as progressive web apps. And I've italicized the progressive because it's not an all or nothing. It's just extra features one can add to a website. And while it sounds like a very powerful new technology, it is actually just HTML5. It's been around for a long time. It uses service workers, which I'll get into, which are sort of an offshoot from web workers. And I couldn't find when they first came out, but they must be 5, 8 years old. So, I mean, it's an old technology. And just a little bit, this is me. If you want to know more about me, this is my GitHub repo. I'm going to jump to the agenda because I just want you to know that there's lots of resources that we're going to look at on our demo app, including some online courses, one that I created myself, another one on YouTube. We have the repo, everything you'll need will be on the site when we get there. And really today, I'd like to sort of demystify progressive web apps and just call them websites that can work without an internet connection. Well, they'll need one initially, of course, but basically the whole concept is basically transferring the website to the local device that can work offline and then connect as it's needed. So if we go to Wikipedia, if you're looking at the actual progressive web app application definition, and I've highlighted again here that progressive, it's one can use just a few features as needed. It's not an all or nothing. It could be a very, very simple offline facility or a UI, the add to home screen. And you can see basically from this definition that it is just HTML, CSS, JavaScript, vanilla, and works with all compliant browsers to different degrees, and is also available to make sort of like desktop applications as well as on mobile devices. And there's this fact here that the brain, anything under 100 milliseconds is deemed to be immediate by the brain. And that's one of the kind of the target times that when you load a page is to get it to be in 100 milliseconds, because then it seems instant. Now, before we get on and I show all the stuff they know, I just wanted to talk a little bit about myself, because I find tech quite hard at times. And I sometimes wonder why, because it's not necessarily so complex. There are far more complex things in development that I've done, but it can be quite hard to learn new topics. And I've got an old school buddy who's a neuroscientist, a neurologist, and he talks to me about brain shapes, that it's not that it's difficult, it's just foreign to our brains, and it takes a while to shape the brain to understand a new concept. So if you don't grasp things straight away, don't worry. It took me a fair amount of time to actually get these concepts and actually understand them, to be able to speak them and talk about them rather than just getting it straight away. I tend to have the delusion that as a developer, I should understand all this tech stuff the very first time I come across it. But I think the only reason I get to understand it is I just spend an awful long time going through it, and eventually it sticks. So with a website, as we all know, we have our device and we have a web server, and we make a connection to get it, and everything goes through the browser's own cache. And there are different policies, but sometimes a request will come here, and if it's not stale or following certain rules, we'll just get something back from the browser rather than going to the network. The browser always has its own cache and its own policies, depending on what's sent through the server and what the client does, etc. Now, if we move to the sort of more advanced technology, which is just HTML5, we can see a number of new actors. And I'll just quickly jump back to the agenda because I jumped too fast forward. What we're going to do today is mostly look at a demo app online, see it behind the scenes and demystify it. But initially, I'm just going to go through the actors in the app so we just know what the terms mean. Most of this talk is literally going to be, there's a live site you can all go to. You can go and see it on your mobile phone and see how it all works. We have lots of resources, and the aim is to be informative tonight, but not taxing. So tonight, just get a high-level overview of what PWAs offline access is, and worry about learning over the weekend at some other time. Don't try and understand everything. It's too many new concepts and too many new things to take in. Appreciate a high-level view. So going back now, we can see we've got a service worker, which is a JavaScript file, which we add into our site, and we'll look into that a bit later. But what we have in HTML5 is we have the cache API, which is a sort of cache not the browser cache, but our own cache, where we can store web pages locally on the device. It's effectively a web server. We also have IndexedDB, which is an asynchronous transactional-based database in the browser that's quite powerful, JavaScript-based, can store files, images, videos, a lot of data. It was developed about 10, 11 years ago, so its actual implementation is very kind of clunky, but they're modern libraries that make it much easier, make it like a database like Firebase or Mongo, nice, easy commands. So in our device, on our mobile phone or on our desktop, in any browser, we have our web page and we have IndexedDB. I'm just going to open up IndexedDB as a database. And we also have our cache API. So effectively, we've got our own web server on the browser. So what we can do is we can basically, when we make requests, this service worker that sits between the site and the operating system, that kind of is always active, even if it's asleep, even if the browser's closed. It sort of it hovers between the site and the operating system. It can make decisions and it intercepts. One of the features, it intercepts every fetch request that goes out. So when we're in our service worker, we can decide whether to go to our cache to get the file, or if we don't have it, to go to the network to get it, to store it, many different caching strategies. So when we'll see the app that we've kind of the demo app that we're going to be working with, as soon as we load up the home page, we're going to store lots of data, some posts, we're going to store a lot of files. So we can go offline almost straight away. And then as we get connection, basically load more stuff, become intelligent. Because what I like about service workers is they give us the ability to be an intelligent web page, meaning that based on certain events that the user does, we can then load pages, preload in advance. And we'll show some of the techniques that Google does to make itself very fast. So this service worker, it's a JavaScript file. There are some nuances to it. Basically, can interact with the operating system to give us full kind of native application facilities. It can intercept requests. It has a messaging system. It can't access the pages. And let's just move on to service workers here. If we move on to service workers, they're essentially event listeners from the page or the device, and the fetch request being the most important one. And we can't use Ajax or Axios in service workers. It's got to be the fetch event. It's the only one it can intercept at the moment. That may change, but it's the fetch API that it can intercept. These service workers can go to sleep and get woken up when an event occurs, for example, like a notification or a push notification from a server or from a site. There are a number of different sort of cycles in the service work, and we're going to have a look at them. We can do notifications. We're going to see examples of that. We can also have something which is called background sync, which is when we're going to send a form offline that will basically wait till it comes back online, then process it. Security is very important with service workers because of their power. So they only have scope within their own dominion, within their own root folder. Although there are some variations, you can place it elsewhere, etc., and define the scope. And they must have HTTPS, unless on local hosts, for security reasons. And one of the limiting factors for PWAs is security. It's not that the technologies don't exist or the APIs don't exist. It's making them secure because it's over the web. So that's where most of the work is being done. Now, some of the things you've heard about, like PWAs, the installability, adding to the home screen, getting the icon on the mobile phone. And many times a client might say, you've built me a really wonderful website. Can you build me an app now? And what they mean is, all I want is this button on the home screen that my clients can actually click on. And that's where PWAs for most browsers becomes very effective. And we're going to have a look at this site when we go to our little demo site to see what you can do in your own browser. So we've talked about a service worker. We've said we've had a look at the cache API. It's an HTML API, not a service worker feature, and basically stores request responses in its cache so that we can basically serve up local web pages. We've seen we've got IndexedDB, which is an asynchronous transactional and JavaScript object key value pair. It can store JSON files, images, videos, can store 50 megabytes or more, depending on the browser, depending on the size of the device. As I said before, it's quite clunky, but there's many good libraries that we'll be using in our little demo app. And the demo app that I've got for you, you'll have the repo. You'll have a very small PWA ready-made that basically just needs to change a few configuration files and you're good to go. We have messaging and notifications, and we can use the post message API between the service worker and the web page. The operating system can send notifications to us and it can receive notifications. So the service worker can receive notifications from elsewhere. And we're going to be seeing some examples of this once we go to the demo app. So just so that you're familiar with all these terms, the post message API, we can pass messages between the service worker and web page back and forth. We can also have notifications, those things that come up on the side. You see them all on your mobile phone. We can do that too. And we're going to see an example of when you go onto your mobile phone, you can fill in a form, go offline, close your browser down, go online again, and you'll get a notification that the form has been sent. And we'll be able to see that also on the desktop as well. And that's the kind of offline form submission. Basically, what we can do is, if I'm going to go in here, is actually show it, is if we have a page, we capture and store the information in the form, we register a certain event with the service worker listens for this, it then gets the data, does any tied up and cleaning, and if it's offline, it'll wait till it's back online and then send a notification to the web page. And that really is all I want to do on terms of PowerPoint. What I'd like to do now is go to the site and you'll be able to see it. So I'm going to go into my browser. And you can all go here. I'm going to put into the chat the actual link. It must be HTTPS for security reasons to get all the PWA stuff. So I'm just going to type this into the chat. And you can see it either on your mobile phone or on your desktop. I'm going to work with the desktop. So if we go in there, and as you can see on the front page, I basically got all the useful links that you might want to do. Now, one of the most important ones will be this, what web can do today. If we open that up, you'll be able to see in your browser what your browser supports in terms of the progressive web app features. I'm using Chrome, which has got the most, and you can see it's got an awful lot. If you go into a different browser, you're going to have a lot less. And the ones we're sort of really interested in is offline mode, background sync, local notifications, home screen installation. We're going to have a look at that. Those are the main ones. Now, there's lots you can do with a progressive web app for the UI and different. We're really going to focus on kind of speed and performance. Now, if you notice up here, that may have come across if you're in Google. But if we do this, this would be the add to home screen button. So straight away, if I install that, you can see I've got this sort of native app look and feel, obviously different on a desktop. But if I close this down here and I'll close these things, all my windows, we can see we've now got the icon here. And this is the kind of a feature. So if you go to the mobile site and actually do that, you should be prompted. If you're in sort of like an iPhone or something, there's a different way to add to home screen. But if you're using sort of Android, you will get the banner at the bottom that says, do you want to add to home screen? And I can click this on and you can see straight away, we have a kind of desktop application. I'm actually going to uninstall it now so that I can go back to the main site. So I'm going to go back in. So we've seen what web can do. And what's very good about this site is actually if you click on anything, it actually gives you a lot of the code and also the browser support. Now, this is background sync, which is sending offline forms. This one's not so well supported. It's basically Google and Edge, because Edge uses Chromium, the engine for Chrome. But if we look at anything else, if we come back into features, for example, and do offline mode, You can see the coverage is far greater because it's service workers. It's nearly 100% in all modern browsers. So we'll go back to the site. And as you can see, we can also have a button here that we click, because sometimes users won't know about this feature up here or miss it. You can add to home screen. We can capture that event. And when we have a little look at the code, all of these things will be explained, because what we've got on the page here, we've obviously got the site we're in here. We've got what web can do today. That's my repo, my CV. The repo is here with all the PowerPoint slides, the code, everything you could possibly want. One of the best resources in terms of sites is Google's offline cookbook. We'll have a quick look at that. That has all the code snippets. And just to let you know, there's not a lot of code. Most of it is boilerplate. There's only really one file that we have to change for most sites, and that's kind of the configuration of what we want to cache. I have a PWA course on Udemy. There's a free coupon available to Saturday that basically is based on this whole site, covering everything. And there's also a very good series on YouTube by NetNinja that goes through it as well. So there's there's one great resource and my resource here that goes through all of that. And I just wanted to remind everyone that we're really talking about HTML5 today. There isn't a framework, there isn't anything special. It's all things that have been part of the browser for a long time. And one thing that struck me was, well, when we were creating websites and learning a bit of JavaScript, why didn't people teach me about offline access? Because that sort of seems to be the critical thing. So what I'm going to do is go into DevTools F12. And one thing you can notice, I've got my tabs in a different place. I never knew this. I learned this from one course, but you can move them around. We're going to spend a lot of time in this application tab, a little bit in network, and obviously in console, we can see various things. But if you look here, we've got IndexedDB and we've got cache storage. What I'm going to do is go into storage here and clear the site data. And if you keep your eye just on here and here, if I go to the home page, you'll suddenly see that, for example, the cache storage has opened up some folders. These are just basically folders with our names that are now storing pages that we'll be able to use if we're offline. And we're going to go through the different caches, but I can go to service worker, go offline, and we can capture the event of online, offline. We'll look at that. You can see we're offline, I've graded out. And if I do this, it's exactly the same. I preloaded these pages. So if I go into posts, it's basically going through all my posts. These posts were stored in IndexedDB, the database, and I've created them. They're from a WordPress site, but basically it's just some posts. Contacts, I've gone to randomuser.me, and let me just go back here. Have we got our database here? Those are the random users. Let me go service workers. There we go there. They're installed. If we refresh the page, we still got them. We can also, I've not cached this page, but just to show the robustness of PWAs, we can have what's called a fallback page, that if we click on a page that we've not stored, we can store a particular fallback page just for the user experience, and it could be a link to stored articles, etc. So straight away, if we come back online, so when we come into our home page, we've seen how we've loaded in data. This is from random user. I've just gone to the internet to basically get some data. I've got some posts. I've loaded them into IndexedDB. I've stored a lot of pages in here. If we open this up, you can see articles. I've loaded what's called the shell, which is not all the files of the site, but just what's essential to kind of make it work to start with. So for example, as I say, when we go offline, posts, here we're just basically connecting to our database with our precast pages. And notice how we can also have a dynamic cache. A new cache can be formed so that we can store pages as we're going through our site. Now, what we can do is almost make like what we call intelligent web pages. If we keep our eye on this set of caches here, if I come in here and I'm going to load in a separate page, and I want to avoid actually going onto the page because it will actually trigger events. But if I come to, I've got to see, I've typed in a wrong file by mistake, but it hasn't crashed because it's got a nice fallback page. If I come in here, and that's because I'm offline, Let's refresh. Now, if we look down here, we've just got 3 caches. And this is a trick Google does, that when you hover over something, it can preload the page. So if you notice, as I come over this, notice how I got this, and I've already loaded in one of the pages, the sample 01. And if I go over the other, that's loaded. If I now go offline, that works. So you can see in a sense that what we're really doing is basically we can create folders in our browser, go get pages, store them based on events, clicks, mouse overs, etc. So really we can focus on just getting the minimal amount of information we need to start with, get a nice first few landing pages, then depending on what the user's doing, get more, or we can even use the browser idle API that when the browser's idle, suddenly start loading in more and more information. And if we go to storage, we can also get access to the size of the storage, and you can see what we've been stored here in IndexedDB. Those posts is what, 31 kilobytes. We can see all of that information there. So really, if somebody was to say to you, let's make a local website on the user's device, how would we do that? We do it with IndexedDB to store data. And we'd also kind of create folders that basically store pages as we need them. The pre-cache, this is just the name I've given them with a version number. It doesn't mean anything, the name, but it's an identifier for me. It's all the sort of essential kind of files that we'll need for the shell. And I split them between local and basically remote, because these are transaction based. And if you make a spelling mistake or you miss one of these, all of them will fail. So it's good to keep the kind of local and the remote separate, just in case a remote service is not available. You're not stopping all of these being formed here. Then we can also create caches on the fly to store information as we go to the network. Because if you remember, when we came back into this diagram here, if we have, when we first start up, we can load our cache with the pre-cache, all the useful kind of files that we need just for the shell, the minimum amount, so we don't waste time loading the whole page. But thereafter, we're going to go to the network to kind of get pages. And what we can do, the service worker, when it gets it, based on the logic we give it, it obviously returns it to the browser, but it can store it in the cache so that next time, if we're using a cache first policy, it will go to the cache and get it. Because there are many different policies that we could use depending on the type of resource. And when we start looking a little bit at the code, we can just begin to see how we can kind of intercept the request, see what type of request it is. Is it an image? Is it a CSS file? Is it an HTML page? And cache it accordingly. So going back, if you're on the site here, you'll sort of see the PWA icon here. You can see we've been through that. We've seen, if we go into service workers offline, we're now back online. We've seen IndexedDB, we've seen our cache storage. And there are some nuances with service workers. It's more the life cycle and the order of things, like everything in dev. It just takes a little practice to go through it. And it's not uncommon to make lots of mistakes with them because there's a certain order one has to do things to make sure it's cached properly. You probably see me making them already. Now that's been basically getting, we've gone to get pages, we've gone to get our sort of database. And just as we come back here, for example, if we look at caching strategies, we can have many different types of caching strategies. We can have cache and network only. We may have for say like stock prices, network only. If we're doing day trading, we don't want to know yesterday's a cash price of a stock. We only want network. Most common is for PWAs is what they call offline first. So go to the cache, then network. And we can do cache, then network, and then save a copy to the cache for next time. We could do network, then cache, all different types of way of doing things. And if we come back to articles, although we're going to have a look at the kind of JavaScript vanilla, if you're doing frameworks or want a library, there is Google Workbox, which basically is a nice abstraction above it. I personally find the vanilla version more useful. And as you see there, we got, this is a PWA. It's coming straight up. So if we cancel that and go into F12 and see what's actually kind of in stock, you can see it's developed It's got its own kind of files it's stored here. It's got IndexedDB. It's got lots and lots of information. So it's applying its own policies here as a PWA. And I shouldn't really call it PWA because I'm breaking my own rules. It's just a website that's using HTML APIs to basically create a robust. And part of the robustness was when we saw a page and it wasn't available, how it gave us a fallback page. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this cache. I'm going to delete this cache again. I'm going to go into service workers, click offline. We don't have form pre-cached. So we get a nice fallback page, and that can vary. We can serve different fallback pages. If I go and type in a different page here, for example, sample 01 is giving me, oh, that's because that page is cached. Let me go into dynamic cache. You can see it's there. Let me delete that. We can see that. Delete that there. If we refresh, there we see we get fallback to a different fallback page depending on the type of form we wanted. Now, how do we make all these magic? We've seen how we've had the IndexedDB and the cache API. If we come into service workers, we can see that we're going to have a look at the file itself, but we can see we've got a service worker here that basically is the magic. The PWA facility, this UI facility, is really based on this so-called manifest.json file. That's basically a little JSON file with some configurations that basically stores all the little details so that actually it will have this feature. If you don't have that in a service worker, you don't get this kind of PWA installability. And that'll vary from browser to browser, but you've got to have certain requirements. And if we open up our dev tools, and if we look at the, you'll be able to see it in the repo. But if I come down here and the manifest.json file is this, and it's just basically listing names, short names, theme colors, background colors. You've got different levels of display and orientations and start page. You've got to have a certain number of minimum icons. I think it's 192 or 196 and 512. You've got to have two images, but you tend to have a lot of different sizes just for browser compatibility. But this is the sort of manifest.json file, which is a bit like a CSS file that when we're in our index page, you can see here that basically we load that in, and then the page knows it can be a PWA. Without this, it won't have its information. Plus, it also needs a service worker, which we have to register here. And if we click on that, we'll see that basically the service worker is down here at the bottom. We'll get into that later. But basically, we do a check. Is the service worker in Navigator? Does it exist? Does this browser support service workers? It's most efficient to wait till the load event. And then we register our service worker, and we can print out details as we wish and catch. But that literally is it. It's registering a service worker file, which we'll look at now, and also a manifest file. And you now have an offline near instant, because it's on the device, website. So if we come down to have a little look at our websites, I've split them into different for simplicity. The first one is the service worker file. This is the main file. And don't worry about all these imports. That's because I split things up. A service worker is basically an event listener, and it listens to when it's being installed, and we have a callback function. When it's activated, when it becomes in charge, we can do something else. So for example, when we install our service worker, it's kind of the time when we do load pre-cache. We'll have a look at that function later, but basically we pre-cache all our assets. When we get to the activate, we do any cleanup, changing folders, whatever, because we may have different version numbers. But the most important one is this fetch. And you can see here, I'm using a policy of cache, else network, and store dynamic. Basically, what we have in there, that we go to the cache first. If it's not in the cache, we go to network, we make a copy, store it in the cache, it's available next time. Now, there are other events. The next most important one is the sync event, which is the so-called background sync. And we're going to have a look at that now with the form. Because we've done all our get posts, let's actually have a look at what happens if we're offline and we want to send a form. So let me first of all come in here. Let's go to the form. Now, we can enable notifications. I'm going to come in here and just basically reset this. So you have to get permission from users to have these notifications. If I click on this, notifications blocked, that's something new. They don't like notifications now. They're treating it a bit like pop-ups. But if we come in here and allow, we should then sort of see, let me go and refresh again. That's blocked it. As default. Allow for the site. I'm looking for notifications. Form. Bear with me. I'm going to go to Edge because if you play around sometimes too much, things get tied up a little bit. So let me just come back into another browser and we'll see Edge. WPS. Okay, just async.js. Go to form. Notifications happening. Okay, we'll go back to form. If we go to F12, and if we look at the, if we come in here and if we just type in something here and subscribe, we should see a little notification coming in here. I think maybe I've got to check on that, but we can see we get our message being sent back. We've received your form. Let's go offline. And if you're working, if we go offline now and refresh the page, and if we send something, you can see form date said was saved and we sent, went back online. What we've actually done is stored it here in IndexedDB in form data. Here it is. But it's not been sent yet. If I come back here, go back online, it'll get sent. And normally a notification, I'll do some clearing history, would pop up here. But if you're in a browser, if you're in a mobile, or if we have this and we close this down, it actually even happens when the browser is closed. Because I went into, we come back down into here. I did earlier on today, tested it on my Samsung. I basically filled the form, went offline, sent the form, closed my browser down, then turned on online, and I got the notification come through. So what I'm just going to do is I'm going to go back and I'm going to just see if I can clear some history and just see, I want to get the notifications work. As always happens, it's working all day. And I'm going to go and actually open up a new window, bring this across. Site. There you can see how that install came across. That happened on the first time. Got the add to home screen, got the form, enable notifications. And for some reason, I think I may have turned them off. They're not coming through. What would happen, it does actually work. Or if you go to your mobile device, you're probably seeing it yourself. I've been playing around so much that I think I've done something to it. So, but what we can see really with that form is how, even if we're offline, we can actually still do form submission. I'm just going to see if I can do it a slightly different way. Go offline, subscribe, it's stored here. If I close this browser down, the notification hasn't sort of come through for some reason. Not to worry too much. We'll press on with that in a little bit. So let's just recap where we are. We've seen that we can do the add to home screen. That's the UI. And we can see how it would look like a native app. If any of you are doing it on your phone, you can actually see it doesn't have the browser bar, although you can actually include it if you want to. You can specify the PWA. We've seen how basically we store data and pages in the cache API and in IndexedDB so that we can go offline. It's all kind of working, so back like that. We can detect whether we're offline or not to kind of give a user experience. We've seen the forms, and for some reason we don't get the notifications, but we've seen how we can send data across and how it actually gets stored so that we can use it later on when we're offline. When we come back online, we've got access to that form data. So this is in essence what it is. So let's go back and start looking at some of the code just so that it doesn't seem so mysterious or so complex. We've seen that basically we're listening for events. We listen for an install event, an activate event, and the fetch event that basically has a caching policy. So if we have a look at some of these other files that we've loaded in here, the only file really that we change from site to site is, shall we say, the pre-caching. And this is as complex as you want it to be. Remember how we saw these folders in the cache? I call them pre-cache-v with a version. You can see that these files here are my minimum that I wanted to store in the pre-cache. And I've made a note here that basically be very careful. If you make a typo or have a file that you declare here that doesn't exist, you'll get an empty cache. So that's the reason. And that's why I've separated between remote and local assets. Now, this is the only file that for, say, a couple of pages that will change from site to site, which pages I want to save, and maybe what are the names of my fallback pages or my caches. If we have a look at, shall we say, caching patterns, the very first one is cache else network. And you can see that basically we're intercepting the event and opening up the caches, getting the URL from the caches. This is like the name of the file. And we return either in the cache or we go to fetch. And that's the simplest kind of strategy, cache else network. Get it from the cache first, then go and get it from the site. But we obviously can have far more complex. So this is the cache else network type, cache first policy. But the one I've been using is this one here. And it seems a little bit more complex, but really in a sense, it's saying what it actually says is go try and get it from the cache. If you can't get it from the cache, go to the website. When you go to the website, clone it, put it in the cache for next time, and then return it to the web page. And you can see here in the catch function, I've basically intercepted the request, and based on it, I can then send back a fallback page. And we saw that when we had the form page, I sent back this page. And if it wasn't the form page, when it was a sample page, I sent back this page. And these have just been hard coded into the assets. So that's kind of caching strategies. And if we come back to the site and go to posts, and if we go to the dev offline cookbook from Google, we can see that all these different strategies are available with the code. So it's quite very helpful. You've got different ones here. You can see here when we install the event, we go to network, then we put it into the cache, all the different kind of strategies that we can use. But what's easy is you can see that basically the code's ready made for you. And it's all saying, go to the cache, get it. If not, go to the network, put it in the cache. Not a lot of code for really what's a very powerful kind of feature of a PWA. So as I've said in the links here, if we go through onto here, we can see that that resource is here. And there's many more different sites that you can go to that have more code snippets. But going back to the code, if we wanted to make this site offline, and we hadn't, to get the PWA installability, I need to make sure I've got some images. This is what I call my images manifest. We need to have our manifest.json file. And then we need to have our service worker. That could be a very simple kind of 3 or 4 lines of just this: install, activate, and fetch. And then just basically say which files we would want. Now, compared to the type of work we do as developers, that's not very complex. I think we do far more complex things. So when you go to the repo, this is the actual site here. And for example, what I did is if I come into my FileZilla, I thought, well, I better make one for myself because I normally have my own site here, Craig. And you can see it's just some JavaScript, CSS, and there's really only one page. It's the index.html. But to make it a PWA, I literally copied the same stuff that I've done in this other folder. I needed to have the special images so that it could be installable. I needed to put in my manifest.json file. And you can see here, they're exactly the same files. The only ones that differ is this one here, which if I open up, is basically just a different set. And really, you could just have index.html. You could just have your one main page if you've got a single page that basically is what you store. So this would be basically how I transform my site into a PWA, just literally copying and pasting a number of folders across, because most of these files here, if we look at them, there's nothing specific. It's all hard coded. It's all the same, whichever site you go to. Obviously, the fallback pages, well, that's hard coded there. Our kind of strategies might differ, but in terms of messaging, there's nothing that's particularly unique for the site. So I'm going to pause a little bit in case people want to sort of just make any comments or questions, and just try and open up my, I want to try and try and see everyone. I've lost track of where I am. So any thoughts or kind of comments about that? We can do it popcorn style. Does it seem as sort of,
we've had a great question in the chat, Craig. Orna is asking, do offline capabilities pose any limitations on the kind of backend that can be used?
No, because not to my knowledge, because if actually, I mean, what I've got on my desktop, I've got a React PWA. I opened that up. Basically, I did the create React app PWA template, and that basically had its sort of service worker here. If we look at this, this is the file here, and this is the workbox. So you can see with Google Workbox that basically it installs little things to make it easy, if you think it's easier, to actually kind of pre-cache register routes and do different things. So in terms of backend, it doesn't matter, because actually what's happening, the way I'm actually sorting the backend here is if I go to my JavaScript file and if I go to load posts, I'm basically just going to an API, storing all the data and literally just putting it in using IndexedDB. There's a library here, IndexedDB, for example, here where I get data and I can store it in. So actually it's a regular page that basically just goes to an API and stores data. So the backend in terms of the database, so long as it's a regular API, makes no difference. That's just JSON data. And in terms of pages, well, that's just all HTML, CSS, JavaScript gets loaded in as we've seen. Does that answer the question?
Whilst we're waiting for everyone to reply, if that's okay, Jan has got his hand raised.
Yeah.
Jan?
Yeah, sure. I was going to say, there was, I think it was in your service worker assets file. There was a little comment in there I spotted about what happens if you don't include some of the files that you try and call.
Okay, well,
that one, line 29.
Yeah. See, what happens is it's very particular. Now, supposing I make a typo here. This can happen. You can make a little typo, or you might make a file that you've called here but isn't in your site. So that's what I'm doing here. Sometimes you do that. So if we come back here and open up and go to F12, I'm going to clear the site storage and I'm going to go refresh the page. Go to cache. Well, of course, now that would happen. Normally what would happen, Control H, what would happen is it wouldn't load. So that's why you just got to be fairly careful that when you're in the local assets, that you don't make a typo or kind of basically ask for something that's not available, because it's like transaction based. So if any one of these fail, they all fail and you'll have empty. That's why I split remote from local. That's a sort of technique that basically means, well, if one of these is down, it doesn't affect my local, which I'm pretty sure I've got. Does that clear it up?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, normally it always happens, and I'm trying to demonstrate it, and of course it works perfectly. So that's the note there. So as loading assets is transaction based, because I've done that before. I thought, well, why is it empty? I've done everything right, and I've just noticed I've left in a file from somewhere else. So I really wanted to show the notifications coming through, but I'm sure you all know notifications coming through. I don't know why I've done something on my computer that stopped. It's been working fine as always with demonstrations all day, and I'm just trying to get load up onto to see everyone, but I've kind of lost track of windows. So if we come back here again, we've seen the offline submission, so we can do offline forms. Now, not all browsers support it. I think Firefox and Opera don't support. And if we go into what web can do today, and if we go to background sync, Chrome does it, but if we look down here, you can see it's not very well supported. So it really is browser specific, that offline capability. And obviously there are more APIs available. There's something called periodic sync, which is actually what background sync sounds like, is that you could set a timer that even if you're not in your browser overnight, it can load in new information and new files and do things at a certain time. That's called periodic sync. And if we go back and actually have a look at all the features, you can sort of see, kind of especially with sort of Chrome, user idle detection. Actually, that's the sort of the wake clock so that it doesn't go dark. It's actually coming through. There are some examples of that, but permissions, you can see all the different things we could do, run on startup. Obviously, you've got camera, microphone, because what I'd like to show you is Google's Fugu. Google has a project called Google Project Fugu, and it's designed on the Japanese fish that if it's cooked properly, it's delicious, but if it's not, it's poisonous. And that's why they call it Fugu, because PWAs, because of what they can do, if it's not done properly, will have a lot of security breaches. And they've listed virtually everything they're going to be working on. And you can see things like badge API, wake clock, all these things that are coming through in the various different versions. And it's Google's mission that a PWA will do exactly the same as a native app. And they've scheduled everything there as what they're going to be working with. So in the future, it will probably be like file permissions, file system, contacts, social contacts. All of these features are gradually coming through, so you can do far more. My focus today really has been on how can we make our website simply better when it's offline, and how make it more robust if it doesn't have a page. Basically, it can handle it, so you never get the dinosaur. That's the main example of this talk here. But you can see there'll be a day when it's just apps, not native apps, not PWAs. So that's the link there. And we've seen Workbox. So like if you're doing frameworks, you generally have Workbox, which is in there. And basically, it's just a library that makes it easier to create a service worker. But as we've seen from the code, it's not that complex to do a lot of different things. I mean, if we see what we've done in this app, we basically got offline access, fallback capabilities, sending forms, notifications, which don't actually work on my particular app at the moment for some reason. All of these things work. And just the main things, if we go behind the scenes and look at our dev tools, just the fact that we can load in all these files. So we have a local web server and we have a local database. That's a very robust database. I mean, you can see it contain a lot of data. We have different libraries. We can certainly see that it doesn't take a lot to take a website to having some offline capability and even installability without too much complexity. And as a saying, easy when you know how. But actually, hopefully this talk has sort of demystified what a PWA is. And really, we shouldn't really, I don't like the term PWA because it makes it sound like it's an application, another framework. How do I integrate it? It's just HTML5, IndexedDB, cache storage, service workers, they're HTML5 APIs. So I think that's all I really wanted to sort of talk about. Everything is on the repo, all the slides, and just to remind you, a number of different very good series here. I have a little course that's based on all of this to explain all these different things. It's a free coupon. It expires in 2 or 3 days. So do make yourself with that. Do feel free to contact me. And you have the repo here that basically has a ready-made PWA for you, the one we've just seen that you can just chop and change. Slides. That's it.